Rachel Williams had learned to make herself invisible long before the Army taught her how to disappear behind a camera. Growing up as the only daughter in a family of hunters, she'd mastered the art of moving quietly, breathing slowly, and watching everything while saying nothing. Those skills served her well now. Standing at the back of the gear line, while Sergeant Connor Hayes rattled off mission assignments like he was reading a grocery list, the Colorado mountains stretched endlessly around forward operating Base Granite, their peaks cutting sharp lines against the winter sky. Rachel adjusted the strap of her equipment case and waited for her name to be called. It never came. "Thompson, you're on point with navigation," Connor announced, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. "Rodriguez takes medical support. Johnson handles communications relay." Each name carried weight, purpose, respect. Rachel's camera equipment suddenly felt heavier against her shoulder. Marcus Johnson caught her eye from across the formation and offered a subtle nod. He was the only one who'd bothered learning her name during the first week of training. The others called her Camera Girl when they remembered to call her anything at all. "Williams," Connor finally said, not bothering to look up from his laminated assignment sheet. "You'll document weather conditions and general terrain features. Stay with the rear element. Try to keep up." The dismissal in his voice was surgical in its precision. Rachel had heard that tone before from her brothers when they assumed she couldn't handle a real rifle. From her father when he thought she wasn't listening. From every instructor who'd ever looked at her slight frame and decided she belonged behind equipment instead of behind a trigger. She nodded once, professional and silent. Inside her chest, something small and familiar began to burn. That evening, as the team gathered around a propane heater for their pre-mission meal, Rachel sat slightly apart, methodically checking her camera settings. The mountain light at this elevation played tricks with exposure, and she'd learned to compensate with polarizing filters and sensor adjustments that most photographers never bothered to master. "So, if we get hit," Marcus said, spooning peanut butter directly from the jar, "you gonna shoot back with that fancy camera?" The question hung in the cold air like a challenge. Luis Rodriguez looked up from his medical kit, mild curiosity flickering in his eyes. Connor didn't respond, too, focused on his field tablet to acknowledge what felt like mockery disguised as humor. Rachel's fingers paused on her lens adjustment. For just a moment, she considered telling them about the summers she'd spent on her father's ranch, about the competition she'd won before she'd ever touched a military-issued camera, about the rifle she'd left locked in a gun safe back home because her role here didn't require one. Instead, she clicked her equipment case closed and stood up. "Good night, gentlemen." The laughter that followed her across the gravel wasn't cruel, exactly. It was worse, it was indifferent, the kind of sound people make when they've already forgotten what they're laughing about. In her personal tent, Rachel unpacked her gear with practiced efficiency. Her hands moved automatically through the familiar routine. Camera body secured, lenses cleaned, batteries charged. But then she stopped, staring at the broken rifle mount she'd found in the surplus equipment crate earlier that week. The bracket was designed to attach a M4 rifle to a tripod for precision shooting. Someone had thrown it away after the locking mechanism jammed, but Rachel had fixed worse things with less. She'd cleaned the graphite from the threads, tested the rotation, even calibrated it for standard military optics. She told herself it was just curiosity, maybe homesickness for the shooting competitions that had once defined her weekends. But as she held the mount in her hands, feeling its familiar weight, she wondered if part of her had known this moment would come. Outside, the mountains had gone quiet in that particular way that meant weather was coming. Rachel could feel it in her bones, the same instinct that had made her father's best hunting dog before the storm clouds were even visible on the horizon. She attached the rifle mount to her tripod, testing its stability, then carefully removed. It packed everything away. Tomorrow they would climb higher into terrain that didn't forgive mistakes. Tomorrow she would carry her camera and stay out of the way, just like she'd been told. But tonight, alone in her tent with the weight of dismissal still fresh in her chest, Rachel Williams cleaned her tripod mount one more time and tried not to think about how easily her hands remembered the motion of sighting down a scope. The mountains kept their silence, but Rachel could feel them watching. The morning mist clung to the ridgeline like smoke from a dying fire, and Rachel could taste snow in the air hours before the first flakes would fall. She'd been watching the cloud patterns since dawn, noting wind direction and pressure changes, while the rest of the team focused on their gear checks and radio protocols. Sergeant Connor Hayes moved through the pre-mission briefing with military efficiency, his voice cutting through the thin mountain air like a blade. Maps were distributed, routes confirmed, contingencies outlined. Rachel received her copy last, almost as an afterthought. Weather documentation and terrain photography, Connor said, barely glancing in her direction. Standard operating procedure. Stay clear of tactical operations. The phrase landed like a slap. Standard operating procedure for what exactly? For keeping the only woman on the team safely out of harm's way? For ensuring the photographer didn't accidentally interfere with real soldiers doing real work? Marcus Johnson caught her eye and offered a small shake of his head, not disagreement with Connor's orders, but sympathy for the way they were delivered. Luis Rodriguez was too focused on his medical supplies to notice the tension, but something in his posture suggested he'd heard it too. Any questions? Connor asked the group. Rachel raised her hand. What's the communication protocol if I observe potential threats during documentation? Connor's eyebrows rose slightly, as if the question surprised him. Standard radio procedures. Channel 7 for non-urgent observations. And if the situation is urgent, then you get down, stay down, and let the professionals handle it. The word professionals hung in the air like a challenge. Rachel felt her jaw tighten, but she nodded once and let the moment pass. Arguing wouldn't change Connor's mind about her capabilities. It would only confirm his assumptions about her emotional stability. But Luis Rodriguez was watching her now with something that looked like recognition. He'd been quiet during most of their training, professional and focused, but there was an intelligence in his eyes that Rachel had noticed before. He was the kind of soldier who noticed details that others missed. Williams, he said quietly, as the group dispersed to final preparations. You handled that camera gear like someone who knows precision equipment. It wasn't quite a question, but it felt like one. Rachel considered her response carefully. My father taught me that tools are only as good as the person using them, she said, whether it's a camera or anything else. Louise nodded slowly. Mine taught me the same thing, about rifles. The conversation ended there, but something had shifted. Louise had seen past the equipment to the person carrying it, and for the first time since arriving at the base, Rachel felt like someone might actually notice if she disappeared. The team moved out under overcast skies, their boots crunching softly on frost-covered ground. Rachel took her position at the rear, camera ready, watching the world through her viewfinder as they climbed steadily into terrain that grew more isolated with each step. Through her lens, she tracked the subtle changes in light and shadow, the way the mist moved between trees, the patterns of wind across exposed rock faces. But she was also tracking something else, the tactical spacing of her teammates, their sightlines, their natural positions for covering fire. Old habits died hard, and Rachel had been raised to see terrain the way her father saw hunting grounds, as a puzzle of angles, distances, and opportunities. Every ridge could hide a threat. Every clearing could become a killing field. Every high point offered both vulnerability and advantage. She'd never told anyone about the competition she'd won, the trophies gathering dust in her childhood bedroom, the way her father had once looked at her with pride instead of worry. That version of herself belonged to a different life, one that had ended the day her brother David's unit took casualties in Afghanistan. Her parents had made her promise never to enlist. They'd already buried one child's dreams in military soil. They couldn't survive losing another. So Rachel had found a different path, one that kept her near soldiers without making her one of them. But as the team climbed higher into the Colorado wilderness, their silhouettes stark against the granite peaks, Rachel felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. These men were depending on her to document their mission, to capture their professionalism and dedication for training purposes. What they didn't know was that she was also watching over them with instincts honed by years of competition shooting, and a lifetime of understanding that sometimes the person in the back has the best view of danger coming from the front. The morning mist began to thicken as they reached the first checkpoint, and Rachel adjusted her camera settings to compensate for the changing light. Through her viewfinder, the world looked different, sharper, more immediate, full of details that the naked eye might miss. She was so focused on capturing the perfect shot that she almost missed the figure moving through the trees below them, just at the edge of her peripheral vision. When she turned to look directly, there was nothing there, but her camera had caught it, a shadow that didn't belong, moving with purpose through terrain that should have been empty. Rachel said nothing. Not yet. But her finger moved instinctively to her radio, and for the first time since the mission began, she wondered if Connor's orders about staying out of the way might be harder to follow than anyone expected. The fog rolled in like a living thing, thick and purposeful, swallowing the ridgeline until Rachel could barely see Luis Rodriguez 10 meters ahead of her. The team had been climbing for 6 hours, their progress slowed by terrain that seemed determined to test every piece of equipment they carried. Rachel's camera captured it all through specialized filters designed for low visibility conditions. But what worried her most couldn't be photographed. The shadow she'd glimpsed that morning had appeared twice more, always at the edge of perception, always gone when she tried to focus on it directly. She'd tried reporting it over the radio, keying Channel 7 as instructed, but the mountain's granite faces played havoc with their communications. Static answered every transmission, and Connor had grown increasingly frustrated with the technical difficulties. Equipment failure, he'd muttered during their last rest stop, glaring at the radio as if personal will could force it to work. Should have brought backup systems. Rachel had wanted to point out that backup systems were standard protocol for this kind of mission, that someone had made the decision to go light on communications gear. But she bit back the observation. Connor was already looking for reasons to blame their problems on the non-essential personnel. Now, as afternoon light filtered weakly through the thickening mist, Rachel found herself separated from the main group by nearly 20 meters. They were moving along a narrow ledge system, and her position at the rear had naturally stretched the formation. She could hear Marcus Johnson's voice somewhere ahead, calling out navigation markers, but the words were muffled by fog and distance. That's when she saw them clearly for the first time. 4 figures moving parallel to their route, maybe 300 meters below and to the west. They wore mismatched gear and moved with tactical precision, staying low, using available cover. One of them carried something long across his back, a weapon too large to be a rifle. Rachel's pulse spiked. She keyed her radio immediately, abandoning Channel 7 protocol. Contact, 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 she whispered urgently. 4 personnel, western approach, 300 meters below our position. One appears to be carrying heavy weapons. Static answered her. She tried again, switching to the emergency frequency. Any station. This is Williams with priority traffic. More static. The fog seemed to be interfering with radio propagation in ways she'd never encountered before. Through her camera's telephoto lens, she watched the 4 figures continue their approach. They were definitely heading for an intercept course with the team's planned route. In maybe 10 minutes, they would have clear sight lines to the ledge system. In 15 minutes, they would be in perfect position for an ambush. Rachel made a decision that would have horrified her instructors. She left her assigned position and moved quickly forward, using the fog as cover, trying to close the distance to Connor and warn him directly. But the ledge was more treacherous than it had appeared. Loose stone shifted under her boots, and she had to grab an outcropping to keep from sliding. The noise echoed off the rock faces like a gunshot. "Williams!" Connor's voice cut through the mist, sharp with anger. "What the hell are you doing?" She could see him now, crouched behind a boulder with Louise and Marcus flanking him. All three men were staring at her with expressions that ranged from irritation to outright hostility. "Sir, we have a problem," Rachel began, but Connor cut her off. "The problem is you leaving your assigned position and compromising operational security," he snapped. "Radio protocols exist for a reason." "The radios aren't working," Rachel insisted. "And there are 4 hostiles approaching from..." "Hostiles?" Connor's voice dripped skepticism. "You're seeing things, Williams. Fog plays tricks on people who aren't used to field conditions." The dismissal hit her like a physical blow. Rachel felt her face flush with anger and embarrassment, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Sir, I have visual confirmation through optical equipment. 4 individuals, military-age males, moving tactically. One carrying what appears to be an RPG or similar heavy weapon." Marcus and Louise exchanged glances. Something in Rachel's tone had caught their attention, even if Connor remained unmoved. "Show me," Louise said quietly. Rachel raised her camera, adjusting the zoom and focus. Through the viewfinder, she could still see the figures, now closer than before. She handed the camera to Louise, who peered through the eyepiece for several long seconds. His expression changed immediately. "Connor, she's right. 4 personnel, definitely armed, definitely moving toward our route." Connor snatched the camera, looked through it briefly, then thrust it back at Rachel. "I see shadows and fog. Nothing more. Williams, you're clearly not cut out for field operations. Stay here. We'll handle this." The words landed like a physical assault. Rachel felt something break inside her chest, not her heart, but her willingness to be invisible, to stay quiet, to accept being dismissed. "Sir," she said, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest. "Respectfully, I have over 2,000 hours of long-range observation experience. I know the difference between shadows and threats." Connor stepped closer, his face inches from hers. "What you have is a camera and orders to stay out of the way. What you don't have is military training, tactical experience, or the authority to second-guess my decisions." Rachel held his gaze without flinching. Around them, the fog continued to thicken, and somewhere below, 4 armed men continued their approach toward an ambush position that would give them clear shots at the entire team. "Understood, sir," Rachel said quietly. "I'll return to my position." But as she turned away, Louis caught her arm gently. "The camera," he said quietly. "Keep watching. Keep recording. Sometimes the person with the best view isn't the one in charge." Rachel nodded once and moved back to her assigned position. Behind her, she could hear Connor organizing the team for movement, confident in his authority, dismissive of threats he couldn't see. She settled behind her own cover and raised the camera again. The 4 figures were now less than 200 meters away, moving steadily toward the perfect ambush position. In her equipment case, the rifle mount she'd repaired seemed to pulse with possibility. Rachel's hands trembled slightly as she continued watching through her lens, knowing that in minutes, Connor's dismissal of her warnings might get them all killed. The fog pressed closer, and Rachel Williams realized that sometimes being invisible was exactly what the situation required. The fog had become Rachel's ally. thick enough to hide her movements, but not so dense that her camera couldn't penetrate it. She'd retreated to her assigned position as ordered, but Connor's dismissal of her threat assessment had changed something fundamental in her approach to the mission. If they wouldn't listen to her warnings, she'd have to prepare for the consequences of their blindness. Rachel worked quickly and quietly, her hands moving with muscle memory that dated back to countless hours on her father's ranch. From her equipment case, she retrieved the rifle mount she'd repaired during their first week at base. The bracket attached to her tripod with satisfying precision, and she tested its rotation and stability with careful adjustments. The abandoned crate she discovered earlier still lay half-hidden under its weather-beaten tarp, exactly where she'd left it. Inside, the damaged M4 rifle waited like a forgotten tool. Someone had discarded it after a training accident, assuming the warped stock and jammed action made it worthless. They were wrong. Rachel had spent 3 evenings during their preparation phase carefully cleaning the weapon, testing its mechanisms, and confirming that despite its cosmetic damage, the rifle was fully functional. The forward grip was cracked but solid. The stock was warped but stable. Most importantly, the barrel was true and the firing pin reliable. She told herself it was simple curiosity, maybe homesickness for the shooting competitions that had once filled her weekends. But now, as she mounted the M4 to her tripod system, Rachel acknowledged the truth she'd been avoiding. Part of her had known this moment would come. The rifle settled into the mount with practiced ease. Rachel adjusted the height and angle, compensating for the slope of their position, then tested the sight picture through the weapon's iron sights. The fog distorted distances, but her father had taught her to read terrain features even in poor visibility. Through her camera's telephoto lens, she could still track the 4 hostile figures. They were now less than 150 meters away, moving with tactical discipline toward the high ground that would give them perfect sight. Lines on Connor's team. Rachel keyed her radio one more time, switching between all available frequencies. Any station, Mrs. Williams with urgent traffic. 4 armed hostiles approaching ambush position. Request immediate support or evasive action. Static answered. Her, punctuated by brief bursts of corrupted transmission that might have been Connor's voice, but were too distorted to understand. The communication breakdown was complete. Whatever happened next would happen without coordination, without backup, and without official sanction. Rachel checked her watch. Based on the hostiles' rate of movement and the team's planned route, contact would occur in approximately 8 minutes. Connor's group would be exposed on a narrow ledge system with limited cover and no advance warning. She made her final preparations methodically, drawing on training that officially didn't exist. The rifle's magazine contained 12 rounds. She'd checked earlier, though she'd never expected to need them. The ammunition was standard military issue, well-maintained despite the weapon's neglected condition. Rachel adjusted her breathing and settled into a stable shooting position. Through the rifle sights, she could now clearly see the lead hostile figure as he moved into position, behind a boulder that would give him perfect cover and an unobstructed shot at the team's route. He was carrying an RPG launcher, just as she'd reported. 1 round from that weapon would be enough to eliminate Connor's entire team before they could react. The fog swirled around Rachel's position, providing concealment while she made calculations that had become second nature during years of competitive shooting. Wind speed and direction, range estimation, bullet drop compensation, target movement patterns, all processed automatically by instincts honed through thousands of practice rounds. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, calm and certain. You never shoot to end something, Rachel. You shoot to protect something. Hello. The hostile with the RPG launcher was settling into his firing position. In approximately 3 minutes, he would have a clear shot at Connor, Luis, and Marcus. They would never see him coming. Rachel's finger found the trigger, and for the first time since arriving at the base, she felt completely certain of her purpose. She wasn't camera girl anymore. She wasn't the outsider who stayed out of the way. She was the guardian they'd never asked for, positioned exactly where she needed to be to save lives that mattered more than regulations. The hostile fighter raised his weapon, beginning to sight on his targets. Rachel held her breath, steadied her aim, and prepared to do what she'd been trained for long before the army taught her to hold a camera. Some orders, she realized, were less important than keeping good people alive. Rachel's world narrowed to the space between heartbeats. Through the rifle's iron sights, she could see the hostile fighter's finger moving toward the trigger of his RPG launcher. Connor's team was less than 30 seconds from walking directly into the kill zone. The fog provided perfect concealment for her position, but it also meant that when she fired, muzzle flash would be the only thing visible to anyone watching. For a few crucial seconds, the shot would appear to come from nowhere. Rachel's breathing slowed to the rhythm her father had taught her: in-out, natural pause, squeeze. The rifle felt familiar in her hands, despite months of handling only cameras. Some skills live deeper than conscious memory. The hostile fighter settled his weapon against his shoulder, sighting down the barrel toward the ledge where Connor's team would appear. His position was textbook perfect, stable, concealed, with clear sight lines and multiple escape routes. He would never get the chance to use them. Rachel's shot broke the mountain silence like thunder. The bullet traveled 270 meters in less than half a second, striking the hostile fighter center mass. The impact knocked him backward, sending the RPG launcher clattering down the slope. The crack of the rifle echoed off the granite faces, multiplying into a cascade of sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The remaining 3 hostile fighters dropped into defensive positions, scanning frantically for the source of the shot. They were looking in the wrong direction. Rachel had already begun to move, detaching the M4 from her tripod mount and sliding both weapon and camera equipment to new positions behind the boulder formation. The fog would conceal her movement for maybe another minute before it began to lift. Below, chaos erupted among the hostile fighters. One was shouting orders in a language Rachel didn't recognize. Another was trying to drag their wounded comrade to cover. The third had his rifle raised, sweeping the terrain for targets he couldn't identify. Connor's voice suddenly burst through the radio static, clear and urgent. Contact, contact, contact. Taking fire from unknown position. All units, we are under attack. Rachel keyed her radio, using the emergency frequency. Connor, this is Williams. 4 hostiles, western approach, 200 meters below your position. 1 down, 3 active. Recommend immediate evasive action. This time, her transmission went through cleanly. Williams, where the hell are you? Connor's voice crackled back. Overwatch position, Rachel replied, which was technically accurate. I have visual on the remaining hostiles. They're trying to reposition for another attack. Through her camera's telephoto lens, she could see Connor's team now. Weeze and Marcus had found decent cover behind a rock outcropping, while Connor was trying to establish radio contact with their base. They were safe for the moment, but the 3 remaining hostile fighters were already adapting to the new situation. One of them was moving in a flanking pattern that would bring him around behind Connor's position. The others were providing covering fire, keeping the team pinned while their comrade maneuvered for advantage. Rachel made another decision that would never appear in any official report. She repositioned the M4, this time choosing a different angle that would give her a shot at the flanking fighter without revealing her exact location. The second shot was more difficult, a moving target at nearly 300 meters, with crosswind that required compensation. But Rachel had been making shots like this since she was 16 years old. competing in long-range precision events that her father had driven 6 hours to attend. The bullet found its mark. The flanking fighter dropped immediately, his weapon spinning away across the rocky ground. 2 down, Rachel reported over the radio. Remaining hostiles are in retreat, heading southwest toward the tree line. Connor's response was immediate. Williams, what's your position? How do you have visual on targets we can't see? Rachel considered her answer carefully. The fog was beginning to lift, and soon her elevated position would be visible to the team below. There was no hiding what she'd done, only explaining it. Sir, I'm approximately 100 meters above your position, northeast ridge. I've been tracking the hostile movement since early morning. Radio communications were compromised, so I couldn't warn you in time. A long pause. Then Luis Rodriguez's voice came through the static. Connor, she just saved our lives. That first shot came from someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Rachel remained in position, watching through her camera as the 2 surviving hostile fighters disappeared into the forest below. The immediate threat was over, but questions were just beginning. She carefully cleaned the M4 rifle and returned it to its hiding place in the abandoned crate. The weapon had served its purpose perfectly, just as she'd known it would. Some tools were too valuable to discard, even when their value wasn't immediately obvious. By the time Connor's team reached her position, Rachel had resumed her official role as mission photographer. Her camera was ready, her equipment properly arranged, her expression calm and professional. But Luis Rodriguez looked at her with new understanding, and Marcus Johnson's nod of respect carried weight that hadn't been there before. Connor approached with questions in his eyes, but before he could speak, Rachel handed him her camera. The memory card contained clear footage of the hostile fighters, their weapons, and their tactical approach, evidence that would justify everything that had happened. Sometimes, she said quietly, the best documentation comes from the unexpected. Angles. Connor studied the footage for several long minutes, then looked at Rachel with something that might have been the beginning of respect. Good work, Williams, he said finally. Excellent situational awareness. Rachel nodded once and began packing her equipment. The mission would continue, but something fundamental had changed. She was no longer just a photographer who stayed out of the way. She was the guardian who watched from the shadows, and everyone now knew it. The return journey to base took place under clearing skies, but the atmosphere within the team had fundamentally shifted. Connor no longer assigned Rachel to the rear of the formation. Instead, she found herself positioned where she could observe the broadest tactical picture, her camera serving dual purposes as documentation equipment and surveillance tool. Luis Rodriguez had been the first to acknowledge what everyone was thinking. During their first rest stop after the engagement, he'd approached Rachel with the kind of directness that military professionals used when pretending not to discuss classified information. That rifle work, he'd said quietly, checking the dressing. On a minor shrapnel wound. Clean shots, perfect target selection, textbook tactical timing. That doesn't happen by accident. Rachel had continued adjusting her camera settings, not looking up. Sometimes you get lucky with angles and visibility. Yeah, Luis had replied, his tone suggesting he understood exactly what she wasn't saying. Sometimes. Marcus Johnson's attitude had undergone a more dramatic transformation. The casual dismissiveness that had characterized his earlier interactions with Rachel had been replaced by something approaching professional curiosity. He'd started asking her opinion about terrain features and sightlines, framing the questions as photography concerns, but clearly seeking tactical insights. Connor remained the most complex puzzle. His authority had been challenged not by insubordination, but by competence he hadn't recognized. Rachel had followed orders, stayed in her assigned role, and still managed to save the mission. He couldn't discipline her without acknowledging his own failure to properly assess either the threat or her capabilities. The solution he'd chosen was strategic silence. No formal questions about how she'd acquired the skills she'd demonstrated. No investigation into equipment that officially didn't exist. No report that would require explanations he wasn't prepared to give. Instead, Connor had begun treating Rachel like what she'd apparently been all along, a doe, capable professional whose background contained elements that were better left unexamined. "Williams," he'd said during their evening debrief, "your threat, assessment, and documentation work were exemplary. Your positioning provided tactical advantages that weren't initially apparent." Rachel had accepted the carefully worded praise with equal care. They were both acknowledging truths that couldn't be spoken directly. But the most significant change had come from an unexpected source. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Barnes, their base commander, had requested a private meeting with Rachel immediately upon their return. The summons had arrived within hours of their debriefing, delivered by an aide whose expression suggested the meeting's importance. Rachel now sat in the colonel's office, still wearing her field gear, while Barnes reviewed the mission report with the focused attention of someone reading between carefully written lines. "Exceptional situational awareness," Barnes said finally, setting the report aside. "Effective use of available resources. Outstanding mission photography." She paused, studying Rachel with intelligent eyes. "Tell me about your background, Williams." "Ma'am, I was a civilian contractor specializing in military documentation photography before accepting this position. Previous experience in outdoor, recreation and wilderness survival." Barnes nodded slowly. "Outdoor recreation. I see. And this recreational experience included precision shooting sports, I assume?" Rachel met the colonel's gaze directly. "Yes, ma'am. Competitive long-range shooting. Multiple state championships in civilian marksmanship competitions." "I thought so." Barnes leaned back in her chair. "Williams, I'm going to be direct with you. Your official role here is documentation and training support. But roles can evolve based on demonstrated capabilities and mission requirements." Rachel felt her pulse quicken, but kept her expression neutral. "Yes, ma'am. I'm authorizing additional training for you in advanced tactical observation and threat assessment. Officially, this is to enhance your documentation effectiveness. Unofficially, I'm recognizing that your skill set may be more valuable than anyone initially realized." The colonel opened a desk drawer and removed a single sheet of paper. "This is a recommendation for specialized reconnaissance training. Advanced optics, tactical communications, integrated observation systems. If you're interested, you'll be attending the next available course." Rachel accepted the document, scanning its contents quickly. The training program was designed for military intelligence specialists and reconnaissance personnel, not civilian contractors. "Ma'am, I appreciate the opportunity, but I should mention that my original motivation for this position was to stay close to military service without actually enlisting. Family concerns." Barnes nodded understanding. "Your parents lost a son in Afghanistan. I'm aware of your family's sacrifice, Williams. This isn't about changing your status or putting you in harm's way. It's about maximizing your effectiveness in the role you've chosen." Rachel considered the offer carefully. The training would make her more valuable, more respected, more capable of protecting the team she worked with. But it would also make her less invisible, less able to stay safely on the sidelines. "The training includes advanced marksmanship, I assume?" "Among other skills, yes. Precision shooting, target identification, threat assessment, tactical communications. Everything you'd need to provide comprehensive Overwatch support." Rachel made her decision with the same certainty she'd felt when sighting through the rifle scope. "I'd be honored to attend, ma'am." Barnes smiled, the first genuine warmth Rachel had seen from the colonel. "Good. You'll start next month. In the meantime, I'm reassigning you to work directly with advanced reconnaissance teams. Your new designation is Tactical Documentation Specialist with expanded mission parameters. As Rachel left the colonel's office, she realized that everything had changed. She was no longer the photographer who stayed out of the way. She wasn't trying to prove she belonged. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The invisible guardian had become visible, and the recognition felt like coming home. 3 weeks after the mountain engagement, Rachel found herself in a conference room she'd never expected to enter. The walls were lined with commendation plaques and unit photographs, testimony to decades of military excellence. Seated around the polished table were officers whose names she'd seen on base directories, but whose attention she'd never commanded. Colonel Barnes had called the meeting to discuss enhanced reconnaissance protocols, but Rachel understood the real purpose. Her actions in the field had created ripple effects that required official acknowledgement, even if that acknowledgement came wrapped in careful language and unspoken understandings. The after-action review of the recent mountain operation has raised some interesting questions about optimal team composition. Colonel Barnes began, her tone professionally neutral. Specifically, regarding the integration of specialized observation capabilities with standard reconnaissance elements. Connor sat across the table from Rachel, his expression unreadable. The tension between them had evolved into something more complex than simple authority dynamics. He'd been forced to confront the reality that his team's survival had depended on capabilities he'd dismissed, and that knowledge had made him both more respectful and more cautious in his interactions with her. Sergeant Hayes, the colonel continued, your mission report noted that communications difficulties prevented timely transmission of critical intelligence. How might this issue be addressed in future operations? Connor straightened slightly. Ma'am, enhanced communication protocols and redundant systems would help. But the primary factor in mission success was the positioning of our observation specialist in a location that provided superior tactical advantage. Rachel appreciated that he'd avoided mentioning her by name while still acknowledging her contribution. The careful phrasing allowed everyone in the room to understand what had happened without requiring detailed explanations. Major Robert Chun, the base intelligence officer, leaned forward. Williams, your documentation of the hostile forces was exceptionally detailed. The imagery provided tactical intelligence that proved crucial for post-mission analysis. How did you achieve such clarity under adverse conditions? Rachel had prepared for this question. Sir, extended experience with precision optics and careful positioning based on terrain analysis. I also utilized equipment modifications that enhanced image stabilization under field conditions. Equipment modifications, Major Chung repeated, thoughtfully. Interesting approach. I'd like to review those modifications for potential application to other reconnaissance operations. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, touching on topics that danced around the central truth without ever stating it directly. Rachel had saved lives through actions that weren't officially authorized, using skills that weren't part of her job description, with equipment that didn't appear in any inventory. But everyone in the room understood that she'd done exactly what needed to be done, exactly when it needed to be done. When the meeting concluded, Colonel Barnes asked Rachel to remain behind. As the others filed out, Connor paused at the door. Williams, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. And a thank you. Rachel nodded once. Just doing my job, Sergeant. Connor's smile was rueful. Yeah, maybe we all need to think more carefully about what that job actually includes. After he left, Colonel Barnes opened a folder that had been sitting unopened throughout the meeting. Your specialized training request has been approved, she said, but there's been an additional development. Rachel waited, her hands steady despite the uncertainty building in her chest. The Department of Defense has been developing a new program for civilian specialists with advanced tactical capabilities, Barnes continued. It's designed for individuals who possess military-level skills but operate outside traditional command structures. The program is called Enhanced Support Personnel. The colonel slid a document across the table. You would retain your civilian status, but you'd receive official recognition for capabilities that currently exist in a gray area. Enhanced training, specialized equipment, expanded mission parameters. Most importantly, formal authorization to act according to your professional judgment in tactical situations. Rachel scanned the document carefully. The program seemed designed specifically for people like her, individuals whose backgrounds provided military-relevant skills, but whose circumstances prevented traditional enlistment. There's something else, Barnes said quietly. Your actions during the mountain operation didn't go unnoticed at higher levels. This came through channels I can't discuss. She handed Rachel a second document, this one bearing official letterhead that made Rachel's pulse quicken. It's a commendation for exceptional service under extraordinary circumstances. Civilian Meritorious Service Award. It recognizes your decisive action in preserving the lives of military personnel while maintaining operational security. Rachel stared at the citation, reading words that seemed to describe someone else's actions. The language was formal, bureaucratic, but behind the careful phrasing, she could see recognition of everything that had happened on that foggy ridge. Ma'am, this is ... unexpected. Excellence often is, Barnes replied. The question now is whether you're prepared to accept the responsibilities that come with this level of recognition. Rachel thought about her parents, about the promise she'd made never to put herself in the kind of danger that had claimed her brother David. But she also thought about Les, Marcus, and even Connor, good people who deserved to come home safely from missions that required more than standard protocols could provide. I accept, she said without hesitation. Colonel Barnes smiled, and this time the warmth reached her eyes. I hoped you would. Your new assignment begins Monday. You'll be working with specialized reconnaissance teams, providing tactical documentation and threat assessment for high-value operations. As Rachel left the colonel's office, she carried more than paperwork. She carried the weight of official recognition, the responsibility of expanded authority, and the knowledge that her invisible days were over. But she also carried something more valuable, the certainty that she'd found her place in a world that had initially seemed to have no room for her particular combination of skills and limitations. Walking across the base toward her quarters, Rachel passed a group of new recruits conducting training exercises. One of them, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 20, looked up from her rifle cleaning with an expression Rachel recognized, the careful attention of someone trying to prove she belonged. Rachel nodded to her, a gesture of acknowledgement. Between professionals, the young soldier's expression brightened slightly, as if recognizing that belonging wasn't always about fitting predetermined categories. Sometimes it was about defining new ones. 6 months later, Rachel stood on another ridge in different mountains, but this time, everything had changed. Her equipment case now contained gear that officially existed: advanced optics, encrypted communications, and yes, a rifle that belonged to her by name and serial number. The Enhanced Support Personnel program had equipped her with tools that matched her capabilities instead of forcing her to improvise with broken equipment and forgotten weapons. But more importantly, the team below knew exactly who she was and what she could do. Overwatch 1. This is Ground Team Leader. Connor's voice came through her earpiece with perfect clarity. We're approaching the objective. Request confirmation of area security. Rachel adjusted her scope, scanning the terrain below with methodical precision. The advanced optics revealed details that would have been invisible 6 months ago, and Her training had taught her to process tactical information with professional efficiency. Ground Team Leader, Overwatch 1. Area is clear. No hostile presence detected. You have a clean approach to the objective. Copy. Overwatch 1. Appreciate the coverage. The formality was new, but the respect underlying it was genuine. Connor had become one of her strongest advocates after witnessing how effective properly integrated Overwatch support could be. The careful dance of authority they'd once navigated had evolved into professional partnership. Luis Rodriguez was now part of her extended team, having requested assignment to operations that included enhanced support personnel. His medical training combined with her tactical observation created a reconnaissance capability that had proven invaluable in complex environments. Marcus Johnson had taken a different path, accepting assignment to train other soldiers in coordinated operations with civilian specialists. The integration of unconventional capabilities with traditional military structure had become a model for other units. But the most significant change was in Rachel herself. She no longer carried the weight of invisibility or the burden of proving she belonged. Her role was defined, her authority clear, her contributions valued. Her parents had attended the ceremony where she received her civilian commendation. Their pride mixed with relief that she'd found a way to serve without the risks that had claimed David. Her father had looked at the citation for a long time, then simply said he would have been proud. Now, as Rachel maintained Overwatch on another mission in another mountain range, she thought about the strange path that had brought her here. She'd started as someone trying to stay close to military service without becoming part of it, and had ended up creating a new category of service entirely. A radio crackled again. Overwatch 1, Ground Team Leader. Mission complete. Request. Route confirmation for extraction. Rachel consulted her tactical display, cross-referencing terrain features with threat assessments. Ground Team Leader. Recommend extraction route Charlie. Clear terrain, good visibility, minimal exposure. Copy. Route Charlie. Thanks for keeping us safe up there. Rachel smiled, though no one could see it. Just doing my job. But it was more than that, and everyone knew it. She'd found her purpose in the space between traditional roles, proving that value came not from fitting existing categories, but from creating new ones when circumstances required them. As the team below began their extraction, Rachel packed her equipment with the same methodical care she'd always used. But now there was no shame in the rifle case, no need to hide capabilities behind the camera. Everything had its place, and she had found hers. The mountain wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of snow from the higher peaks. Rachel adjusted her jacket and shouldered her pack, preparing for the hike back to the extraction point. Tomorrow there would be another mission, another team depending on her unique combination of skills and perspective. She was no longer the Vanderjay photographer who stayed out of the way. She wasn't trying to prove she belonged in a world that hadn't been designed for her. She was exactly what she'd always been, a guardian who watched from the high places, protecting people who mattered, using whatever tools the situation required. The only difference was that now everyone knew it, and that recognition had changed everything. As Rachel made her way down the mountain, she passed the spot where she'd first learned to steady her breathing behind a rifle scope, years ago on her father's ranch. The memory brought with it the echo of his voice. You never shoot to end something, Rachel. You shoot to protect something. She'd spent her entire career protecting something first, the memory of her brother, then the safety of her teams. Finally, the possibility that strength could be found in unexpected places by people who refused to accept limitations. Walking through the gathering dusk toward the lights of base camp, Rachel Williams carried more than equipment. She carried the knowledge that sometimes the most important battles are won by people no one expected to fight them. And that recognition When it finally comes, feels exactly like coming home. Her story had started with invisibility and ended with clarity. She'd found her place not by changing who she was, but by insisting that who she was had value, even when others couldn't see it. Some guardians wear uniforms. Some carry obvious authority. But the most effective ones are often the people who watch from the shadows, ready to act when action matters most, asking for nothing more than the chance to keep good people safe. Rachel had become exactly what the world needed her to be, and in doing so, she'd shown others that belonging isn't about fitting into existing spaces. Sometimes it's about creating new ones entirely. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.